Do you remember where you were when you first heard about the 9/11 attacks? Maybe you were at work or sitting at home when the news hit. Suddenly, everything stopped. The shock, the disbelief, and the fear felt palpable. Can you still see those planes barreling through the blue sky? Their impact shattering not just the buildings, but our collective sense of safety. The image of those planes crashing into the towers, it's seared into my mind and the minds of millions, as clear today as it was that morning. You've probably heard the rumor or some version of it. How could those terrorist pilots have flown large commercial planes into the World Trade Center and Pentagon? They weren't trained for something that difficult. It had to be a conspiracy theory. It had to be impossible, right? Well, that's a paraphrase of a question one of my great subscribers asked, and the answer will surprise you. As someone with nearly 4 decades of flying experience and an FAA commercial pilot's license, let's dive in to uncover the truth. This story is more about planning, training, and circumstance than some magical, impossible flying. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you will understand how it happened, and you might be surprised by how simple it really was. Hey, before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and ring that damn notification bell, or you may not be notified when the next video comes up. You have to ring that bell and say, yes, let me know. If you've enjoyed this video, YouTube's algorithm won't show you content from channels that you just subscribe to unless you've rung that bell, okay? I'm done saying that. So let's get into straight up facts and myth busting. To give you a sense of what it takes to fly a large aircraft, let me share a personal story. I had never flown a large aircraft before, and one night I entered a full-motion Airbus A320 flight simulator. These are those giant simulators that airplane pilots train on. I walked across a gangway, took my seat in the captain's left-hand position. It was dark. I was completely unfamiliar with the cockpit, never having been in one. But after a few minutes of orienting myself, I could control the aircraft with ease. The simulator controllers would set up the airplane in cruise flight, and I would have to find the airport and land. And once I landed, they would set the plane up in cruise flight again at a different city, a different airport. I'd have to do it all over again. Even though I had never flown this massive aircraft before, I was able to successfully find the airports and execute landings in multiple countries. With my experience, I know that I'd be fully qualified to enter the cockpit on any commercial flight, even though I'd never flown one. If there was an emergency, I would be able to control the aircraft. Now, imagine that I didn't have to land or take off, just fly straight and aim for a giant visible target. Well, that's essentially what the hijackers had to do on 9/11. They didn't have to master the difficult parts of aviation like arrivals or departure coordinating with air traffic control. They took over aircraft that were already in flight and just used basic navigational skills. Now let's talk about the hijackers. These weren't completely untrained amateurs. Atta, who flew Flight 11 into the North Tower, trained extensively in small aircraft, earning a commercial pilot's license after logging hundreds of hours of flight and simulator training on large aircraft. Al-Shahi flew Flight 175 into the South Tower. He trained with Atta, obtaining similar qualifications and experience with Boeing aircraft in simulators. Hanjour, Flight 77, into the Pentagon, well, he was the most formally trained of the group with a single-engine commercial pilot certificate and logged hours in small aircraft. The descending turn he performed towards the Pentagon was a right-hand descending turn, a maneuver he had performed hundreds of times in his flight training and demonstrated competency during his flight examination in the air. It wasn't the death-defying feat people imagine. It was well within his training. And while none of these men were expert pilots, they had enough experience to control an aircraft in flight. And as I'll explain, the conditions they were working with made hitting their targets much easier than many believe. I'll never forget that day. At the time, I was living just outside Washington, D.C. My staff and I were crowded into the conference room, watching the events unfold on television in complete disbelief. In just a few hours, the skies over my house were filled with fighter jets and military helicopters, while everything else, every civilian plane was grounded. The silence in the air mixed with the roar of the military aircraft was scary and frightening and just so sad. That moment and the feelings that came with it have stayed with me ever since. Yeah, I know it sounds complicated, steering massive planes into buildings, but the more you break it down, the simpler it becomes. Want to know how they navigated to those targets? You'll be surprised how straightforward it actually was. But before we get into that, let's look at the maneuvers themselves. Let's be clear. The maneuvers that some call precise weren't as tricky as they seem. Here's why. Flight 11 and 175 into the World Trade Center towers, the hijackers were just flying Boeing 767s. They're large, but with very advanced navigation systems. The World Trade Center towers were enormous, visible from miles away. Atta and Al-Shahid didn't need to perform any complicated stunts. They simply flew straight and aimed at the towers. The weather was clear, making the task even easier. Flight 77 into the Pentagon, Honjour's right descending turn into the Pentagon, it wasn't advanced. It was a basic descending turn, one that Honjour had practiced hundreds of times during his training and demonstrated as part of his air examination. The Pentagon, like the World Trade Center towers, is a massive, unmistakable landmark from the air. Spotting it and flying toward it was straightforward. I mean, to put it into perspective, when I flew the Airbus A320 simulator, I had never been in that cockpit before. And I was navigating over unfamiliar dark skies. Even in those conditions, I was able to find the airports and land with relative ease. The hijackers didn't have to land their planes. They just had to aim. So how did they navigate? Were they expert navigators, or did they have inside knowledge? Not at all. Now about navigation. No, they weren't skilled navigators. They didn't need to be. They had flight management systems in the aircraft, FMS, and Autopilot, which do a lot of the heavy lifting. Once they were in the vicinity of their targets, they disengaged the Autopilot, switched to visual navigation, and think about it. The World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon are huge, visible landmarks. It wasn't like finding a needle in a haystack. It was like spotting a lighthouse on a clear night. Without needing to communicate with air traffic control or follow standard flight protocols, their mission was simplified. They just needed to fly the planes straight into the targets. With the help of modern aircraft systems, that's exactly what they did. So, to answer the question, were these hijackers unskilled and did they somehow perform expert-level flying? Well, the reality is much simpler. They had enough training, used advanced navigation systems, and their targets were large and clearly visible. From my experience as a pilot, hitting those targets was not a difficult task given the conditions and the tools at their disposal. It was tragic and horrific, yes. But from a technical flying perspective, it was achievable with the skills they had. So, the next time someone tells you that the 9/11 hijackers were too unskilled to pull off the attacks, remember that the facts don't require a conspiracy to explain what happened. They had the training and the tools and the opportunity. If this breakdown helped clarify things for you, go ahead, hit subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and let's keep the discussion going in the comments. And don't forget that notification bell, because if you're here for facts and myth busting, you don't want to miss the next one. Hey, also check out the giant reference guide I've got for you in the video description if you want to dive deeper into the details. Stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning the myths that don't add up. Keep your comments and questions coming. Until next time, see ya!